Hey everybody, welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg.
And I'm Berger.
And today, we're taking a look at the earliest automobiles in the Pacific Northwest, aka horseless carriages. And not only how cars caught on, but where intrepid Northwesterners took those cars, what they did or tried to do with these newfangled machines. What was car camping like back in the early 1900s? What were road trips like before paved roads and traffic laws? And did you know that cars were once not allowed at Mount Rainier National Park? If you haven't already seen the video, take a few moments to watch it. It's a great companion to this conversation. Plus, it has some great footage featuring some very antique cars. You can find the video in the show notes, but for now, hop in. Let's go for a ride. Knut, when did the first car appear in the Northwest?
So the first appearance that I can trace was in 1899, actually, and it was a little car that came with a circus.
What, you bought the circus and included was a car?
I don't know much about what kind of vehicle it was, but it was used in the circus parade. You know, when the circus comes to town, there's a big parade, right? And then in some places it would spin around the ring. And it was a complete novelty. Now,
sounds like a go-kart.
Yeah, basically, you think of it that. And I don't think it was a clown car either. And this car made appearances in towns as it traveled from town to town. And so it was probably the first car anybody saw in various Northwest cities, in Oregon certainly, places like Salem and Portland and whatnot. But there's no mention of the car in the circus parade in Seattle, so I can't confirm, but almost certainly it made an appearance at some point in that circus. But the first car that was resident in Seattle was in 1900, and it was a Woods Electric. So it was an electric car, Woods Electric car. It was owned by a guy named Ralph Hopkins, who shipped it out from Chicago, and it was a sensation. I mean, this guy was instantly a Seattle celebrity. He was very popular with the women, and he was, always taking. Yeah. This guy kind of was the first one to, parade around in the vehicle, showing the ladies a good time.
His magnet.
And that car actually still exists. It doesn't have the dry cell batteries that operated it, but the frame and the wheels and all that, it's in the collection at the Washington State Historical Society in storage, basically. He donated it many years later to the museum.
How ironic that in this day of age when we're still sort of arguing about the prevalence of EV and the technology of EVs, that the first car in the Northwest was electric.
An electric vehicle, I know.
Chew on that, Elon Musk.
And, it's interesting because, I'm no expert on this, but in doing research, there was no set technology in the beginning. I mean, they were trying steam, they were trying diesel, they were trying electric, all these different methods, and there were inventors working on this in garages or sheds all over the country, but particularly on the East Coast and in Europe. I think it was either 1899 or 1900 or 1901 that the first car was in Portland. We were relatively late adopters of these vehicles. They were being seen in the 1890s, for example, the steamers and others were being more commonly seen in New York and New Jersey and Chicago and industrial places where they had the manufacturing set up to build these things. So the late 19th century, but it took to basically the 20th century for it to actually reach the Pacific coast.
Do we have any idea how much money Mr. Hopkins paid for his car and where he went with it?
So I know a little bit about where he went with it. He took it, mainly around town, but he could get to Tacoma, only a wealthy person could afford a car. They were rich people toys, basically. Hopkins was a successful hotel owner and, had quite a bit of money so he could do this. And so in the early days, you had a bunch of rich guys zooming around in these new contraptions. And, horses were still the main mode of transportation, wagons, teamsters, and these horses would get spooked by these cars coming in at, 2 or 3 times the speed at which horses operated. And so the urban environment developed a lot of kind of chaos. There were no paved roads, essentially. There were no traffic laws. There were no driver's license. There was no driver training. Even if there were 25, 30, 40, 50 cars in all of Seattle, it created kind of chaos, which then got people mobilized to improve the roads, create standards, laws, speed limits, and that kind of thing. But in the very beginning, there were none of those.
And it sounds like if you were wealthy enough to afford a car, you also needed somebody to get you out of a jam or to fix the car. You had to have some mechanical skills.
Yes, you either had to have those skills yourself, which was not that common among the wealthy. And so chauffeurs were hired because they had mechanical skills, or the rich guy drove the car and a mechanic sat next to him. And you had to bring your own equipment. The only way to get towed would be maybe a farmer could pull you out of a ditch. But pretty soon, as they began going out of the city and visiting these, wilderness and scenic areas, you had to bring a block and tackle. There were no garages. There were no gas stations, whatever. So you had to bring everything along with you. And yes, mechanical skills, knowing how to fix an engine or a steam contraption was pretty essential.
Do you have any records as to how far some of the first owners actually went with their cars?
There were outings in the very early period once you had enough people with cars that you could go as a group, sort of when you see all those groups of motorcyclists going on a weekend thing. Well, they used to do that with cars. So a bunch of these very early horseless carriages would head out, and there were roads they could take that would get them, say, to Long Beach Peninsula. They go to the coast and they would stay in a resort but that's really not until kind of later in the aughts. The example that I use of early long-distance wilderness driving was George Carmack and his wife Marguerite in 1902.
What a fitting name.
Yeah,
Carmack.
Perfect name. So just for a little background, George Carmack was the guy credited with starting the Klondike Gold Rush. He was an early Klondiker before it was famous. He had married an indigenous woman, Kate. He and her family were helping him look for gold. They struck it rich on a place called, after the gold discovery, Bonanza Creek. And he was literally like the first guy to come into town with a big bag of gold. And that, boom, set off the Alaska Gold Rush. So this was in 1896. He became a multimillionaire, basically, and he left the Klondike in 1900, settled in Seattle, had invested in some other mining properties, and he dumped his previous wife, abandoned her, and married a woman, Marguerite, who he had met up in Dawson in the Klondike. Anyway, and they moved down here, married her, and in 1902, he purchased a state-of-the-art automobile and decided to drive from Seattle to San Francisco.
Oh, wow.
They both had family in California, and that was part of it. But also, this would be this kind of amazing adventure with this new technology.
What kind of car did he buy?
Okay. It took me a long time to identify the vehicle. The good news was there was a picture of George and Marguerite sitting in this vehicle in front of the factory that built it, which was back east. And so it was a Model 13 long-distance steam touring wagon by the Mobile Auto Company. And the Mobile Auto Company only lasted a couple of years. They only produced cars for maybe 3 years. But they used Stanley Steamer technology. So the Steamer brothers were famous for their steam cars. They actually were extremely popular. They went out of business. Their technology ended up being used in this type of vehicle, and then later emerged again as a Stanley Company. So it was a steam car that could take 2 people and a lot of gear, and they headed south.
How much do you think he paid for this car?
I don't know. I can't remember offhand what the dollar amount was. I'm guessing maybe $500, $600, something like that. But the equivalent today would be $70,000. You know, there weren't that many people capable of spending that much money at that point. But he was getting something that had sort of state-of-the-art steam technology, which meant it had a robust boiler that wouldn't give you problems. The boiler was heated by white gas, which is essentially like the stuff you used to use for a Coleman stove.
So you could get that almost anywhere.
That was readily available. It was basically a form of gasoline with no additives in it. All you had to do was keep the boiler running, but you had to know how to manage a boiler. And he packed the thing with their camping equipment. You know, this guy had been roughing it in the Klondike for years, so he was a tough guy. And presumably Marguerite was as well. You know, they were undaunted. And so they began heading south in a vehicle. And, you know, let's face it, the roads were basically unpaved wagon roads,
right?
Stagecoach roads. And in some cases, there were no roads. They camped most of the way. In Oregon, they stayed in hotels. They traveled about 60 miles a day, depending on the terrain. And fortunately, they were interviewed when they got to California, when they got to Redding, California. Marguerite was interviewed about what were some of the toughest parts getting down here.
Oh, where shall I start?
But there were some things that came up that I didn't go into in the video. She was being interviewed about why did you do this trip and what was it like? And this is before they've completed it. No one would have thought it possible but George. We have passed through some wild country, up steep grades, over rocky roads, and in a few places where there were no roads at all. In Cow Creek Canyon, Hungry Man's Canyon, some call it, we had no road at all in some places. Not even a wagon had passed over the ground. We had to find our own road. We have come through without even a puncture, in spite of it all. The worst road we had was from Toledo to Castle Rock in Washington. Roberts Hill in Oregon was very bad. We had little trouble passing over the Siskiyous, but we are glad to get out into the Sacramento Valley. So I got curious because I was like, well, Cow Creek Canyon, where's that?
That sounds deadly.
Yeah, well, and it was kind of a nightmare of a place for a lot of different reasons. It's in southern Oregon before you get to the Siskiyous. There was a rail line that went through there, but it kept getting, you know, there were slides that kept blocking the tracks. It was kind of a problematic area. And we know from other parts of their account that in Cow Creek Canyon, they literally had to make their own road. They had to chop down trees and find a way through this kind of roadless area. Then I thought, well, Toledo to Castle Rock in Washington, why was that so bad? Well, it turns out that there's a place on that road. Let me find here we go. I found an account. It says, Pacific Highway between Castle Rock and Toledo was one of the most difficult for motorists to drive over and probably was second only to Carrollton Hill. The 7-mile section from Castle Rock was through swampy land over 2 steep hills. And one of the hills there was notorious for trapping vehicles in the mud, and it was called Gumbo Hill. So these vehicles in the early 20th century would get stuck on this thing. During the wet season, the road was so muddy that cars had to pay farmers to have their horses haul them over the hill.
I can just see a couple of farmers at the top of Gumbo Hill looking down going, here comes another one.
Yes, and somewhere else I came across people complaining about the price. I mean, these guys could charge whatever they wanted. Even if you brought a block and tackle, you might still need help getting out of a ditch or whatever. And, they would charge you $5, $15, $20.
Well, that's cheaper than AAA.
Yeah. Back in the day, there was no AAA, but that was a lot of money. $5, $10 in 1905, a lot of money.
Sure. And similarly to having somebody with you or having mechanical skills yourself, I would think it would be very prudent to bring block and tackle with you wherever you went, just in case.
Yes.
It's like the older version of jumper cables.
Yes, exactly.
Well, how long did it take George and Marguerite to go from Seattle to San Francisco?
It took them about a month. Once they got to California, the roads were better. It was drier, and the roads had, been used by more people for longer. And then they actually drove from San Francisco. They actually drove to Southern California to visit some relatives. And I think they shipped the car back, though. I don't think they drove back. I think they put it on a boat.
Learn the lesson. Well, the whole thing seems like the automotive equivalent of the African Queen,
What would happen if you didn't kick her?
Whole boiler blow up.
But if we're going...
Well, George and Marguerite certainly seem hardy and adventurous. But I'm wondering, how long did it take outdoorsy Northwesterners to use cars to go even further into the wilderness and to use cars to do things that it might seem ridiculous to expect cars to do?
Yeah. You certainly see that within 5 or 6 years of the CarMax trip. By 1907, 1908, people are kind of pressing the envelope. And the great example is Mount Rainier. Mount Rainier becomes a national park, and people want to see it, right? And the way to see Mount Rainier is you take a train.
Right.
And then there's a lodge there, and then you can take a horse-drawn jitney up or ride a horse up to the Nisqually Glacier. And this was sort of the big outing of the early 20th century. In 1907, some well-to-do car drivers start driving there on their own. And it takes 4 or 5 hours to get from Tacoma to Mount Rainier, the entrance to Mount Rainier. And then they begin driving into the park up to the Nisqually Glacier, where they're met by a ranger who says, you can't drive in this park. We have no rule for cars driving in the park. So until you have a permit that lets you drive in this park, you have to leave. Well, these guys are really upset, They're like, well, there's no rule against it. Why are you throwing us out, And they're quite miffed. So the first cars got to Mount Rainier in 1907. By 1908, the spring of 1908, there's a permit system. Yeah, it costs you $5. You have to fill out a form. And cars can come in on a limited basis. They won't let them go all the way up to Paradise at that point, but they can get up to the base of the Nisqually Glacier, which is much closer than it is today. And that is a big tourist thing. And then if you want to go higher than that, you can get in a horse-drawn jitney or something and go further. So this is sort of, a radical change, because once they permit cars in Mount Rainier and more people are getting cars and the newspapers are running articles with maps saying, here's how you get to Mount Rainier, this becomes a huge draw.
It's interesting because, of course, we've normalized cars everywhere. We're very car-centric, and going to even wilderness destinations, you go by car. In that it was such a spectacularly newfangled thing, did outdoors purists think it was disturbing to the outdoor experience to have a car?
Yeah, I think there were people who wanted to continue going on horseback or just hiking on foot. But it didn't really matter. It happened so quickly. Within 10 years, 90% of the people going to Mount Rainier are driving or going in a car. The railroad is no longer something that people are looking to. And in 1915, the city of Tacoma was promoting Mount Rainier heavily for tourism. There was you could take a Milwaukee Road train to Mount Rainier, and they staged for publicity purposes a race between a train and cars to see who could get to. It was called 4 Hours to the Glacier, which became an actual slogan the city used. If you want to see the true wilds in the Northwest, you've got to get to a glacier, and we get you there fastest, Yeah, so they ran a race between the train and car to Mount Rainier. And that, I think just shows you how quickly they got accepted into the promotion of getting to wild places.
Who raced and who won that race?
They selected a number of cars. These were touring cars that could carry, 4 or 5 people. They left from a train station in Tacoma. The train left from the same train station. There's actually a photograph of this massive crowd with cars and a train, and it's, like, we're off. And the train won, but the lead car and the first car to get there and was kind of acknowledged as the auto winner was driven by a woman named O.H. Ridgway. She actually was married to a Milwaukee railroad engineer.
Oh, she had an inside track.
And there was thought that her husband might drive the train. It would be a husband and wife thing, but that did not happen. Anyway, she got a lot of publicity. So we're talking now, this is before World War I, 1915. Big headline in the Tacoma Daily Ledger. Tacoma woman says she lives in her auto. 100-mile spins are zest of life. And an expert mechanic can repair all kinks in motor's engine and has no fear of great speed. And she had a 6-cylinder Studebaker touring car.
What was the prevalence of women drivers early on? Did women take to cars and become drivers and learn about cars and mechanics? I'm sure some of them already knew everything there was to know, having probably worked on farms or worked in factories, etc.
Yeah, cars came about in the era when the suffrage movement was picking up. And there were wealthy women, who wanted to be able to get places themselves, but there was a large kind of stigma against women driving cars. There's an interesting thing here which gives a little insight into that. So with Mrs. Ridgway, the Tacoma paper quotes her saying, "I often go 100 miles or even 200 miles alone," she said. "I'm not a bit afraid, and it is just because I love to drive. If anything goes wrong with the car in any except a most serious way, I can repair it myself, and I always put on my own tires on the road in case of puncture or other trouble." The idea that a wealthy woman or upper-class woman would drive alone somewhere, there was a stigma about that and a concern, safety concern. In the very early days, some of the first women were driving with chauffeurs, and there was a lot of innuendo about what they might be doing out there or romantic relationships. Cars were considered a very masculine thing.
Sure.
And people looked askance at what women were wearing to drive a car or what they were doing or whether they were even capable of driving a car. So there was a lot of skepticism and whatnot about whether females should drive at all. There was also, I read in one book that electric cars were partly marketed to appeal to women. There was something more genteel about an electric car than a noisy steam car or diesel car. That eventually went away, but in the early days, this was somehow more ladylike.
What about the women who really pioneered car culture?
Yeah, there's one woman in particular I came across that has a more current Northwest connection, Mrs. Alice Hoyler Ramsey. She was living in New Jersey. She was married to a wealthy guy, and she decided she wanted to drive across the country. And this is 1909. So this is very early in this period. And
By herself?
no, she took 3 other women with her. So it was a group of women, friends. I think she might have been related to at least one of them. They outfitted a Maxwell Briscoe number 13 touring car, which was advertised as a car you could punish, And basically, she drove from New Jersey to San Francisco in 1909 successfully. And there's a description I found of her in a newspaper article. And the headline on the article, this is just interesting. Plucky woman motorist completes long journey. So this is an article talking about her success. But the description of her, Mrs. Alice Ramsey is a charming little woman with blue eyes and dark brown hair. Her nature is sweet and lovable, and she is most retiring in manner. Would you describe a male driver who just driven the first man to drive across the country that way? No, I don't think so.
Of course not.
So, you could see those kinds of memes that were popularized in the press. So I got curious because in doing research, I came across the fact that a vehicle like Ramsey's had been exhibited at the LeMay Car Museum in Tacoma. And I thought, wow, what if that car somehow ended up in this collection? We could go down and film there. And I found out from the museum that the original car, Alice Ramsey's car, was destroyed some years ago, I think in a fire. But the vehicle that they showed was a same model and had been restored by someone local. And I got in touch with him, Richard Anderson, lives on Whidbey Island, and his daughter recreated in 2009 the 100th anniversary of Alice Ramsey's trip across the country. And his daughter, Emily Anderson, drove the restored vehicle across. So she went across in the same type of car in that original condition. And I just thought that was really cool.
The term horseless carriage, is that a term that we came up with in modern times, or was that a term that was actually used to describe these contraptions?
Yeah, it was used to describe it back in the day. Many of the very early models looked exactly like carriages, just without horses, with an engine that might be in the back, or some of them look like motorized sleighs or buggies, basically. But there was a lot of evolution of the term because you see the term motor car, you see the term automobile or auto. The term car almost always referred to a train car. So you see a headline that says there's a 6-car accident, and it's usually a train wreck or a trolley disaster of some kind. So it took a while for the term to sort of settle into various grooves. One of the places where you see the term like horsepower, this tells you the origin of how strong your vehicle is. We still refer to horsepower. Station wagon. It's not a wagon. It's a car that you can put stuff in the back of, but it referred to the wagons that used to be at the train stations to take you, to your hotel or whatever.
You mentioned station wagons, and of course that is the kind of car that my family had for most of my life because we were a family of 7, 5 boys. We did a lot of car camping, and we sometimes had a house trailer, and we would travel with friends who had a house trailer, or we would have a big extended family meetup at a park with all of these cars. I'm wondering when car camping, as we know it, started
So just from what I observed in the Pacific Northwest in looking at photographs and museum artifacts and that kind of thing, it seems to have really taken off after World War I. So the late teens and 1920s was sort of the beginning of Mr. and Mrs. America and their family going out and camping. And part of this is due to a period of road construction. So in 1915, you get the Sunset Highway over Snoqualmie Pass. 1915, you get the Road to Paradise. You can drive all the way, and just like you can now, more roads were being put in to wilderness areas that were kind to cars, and more people were buying cars. You had the Model T. You had Henry Ford mass-producing vehicles. And so what's interesting is you begin to see these devices that were created for people going camping and getting there with their car. There was one company in Tacoma that was making these wooden boxes that you put on your running board, because cars then had running boards, and it was a cooler. It was like your today's Igloo, except there were things where you could actually put a little frame into your Model T. The roof would be your tent, and the frame would be your bed or your even bunk beds. You could put multi-level things into some of these vehicles, especially as they got bigger, and you could go camping without a tent. On the flip side of that, you could buy a tent that had a side for you and your family and also provided cover on the other side for your car.
Oh, your little mobile garage.
Exactly. And of course, a lot of cars didn't have hard tops. You know, they could get damp. You wanted to protect the engine from the relentless rains and whatnot. So you start to see local companies making things for car campers. And, it just continues from there. You know, the late teens, the 20s, the 30s, this is the period where not only are people car camping, but you have companies like Eddie Bauer, Filson. People are buying camping clothes, camp boots, equipment. Skiing is beginning. The ski industry is beginning. Coleman and companies, creating portable stoves. All this stuff is kind of coming in as the sort of class of middle-class people who are mobile can move into these scenic areas. And, of course, people are eager to because we're surrounded by them, right? I mean, if you have a car, at some point driving around the city isn't fun anymore. And you mentioned the station wagon. Today we don't have station wagons. We have SUVs. Or we have vans.
Right. And we have four-wheel drive, and we have all of this stuff. We sort of want the kind of car that can do anything, even though we're not very ambitious with those cars. We're never going to put them to that kind of test. But we want to have the sort of vehicle that can do anything. And that's, to me, very reminiscent of what might have been happening during the beginning of car culture and car adventuring.
Yeah. I mean, the original sort of van lifers were the people who came out on the Oregon Trail, right? So you could spend 5 or 6 months in a wagon being pulled by oxen or perhaps horses. I mentioned in the video Ezra Meeker, who was one of the founders of Washington State, founder of the hop industry, lived a very long life. He followed the Oregon Trail to publicize it later in life. And he drove a car from St. Louis to Seattle to publicize the Oregon Trail because he wanted it to be a historic landmark. He wanted it marked and that kind of thing. But, those people were traveling that way because they had to.
Right.
And if you can enjoy the wilderness without having to suffer the travails of the early pioneers, you're going to do it.
Thanks for listening to Mossback. The video series is now in its 10th season. If you'd like to see all the episodes from this or any season of Mossback's Northwest, you can find them at cascadepbs.org. This episode of Mossback was produced by Sarah Bernard. Our story editor and executive producer is Sarah Menzies. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen, and whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. And check out the show notes if you'd like to get in touch. Also, if you'd like to support the work we do, join the members who make Mossback's Northwest possible. Your donation will help fund the Cascade PBS lineup of podcasts, the video docuseries we stream every week, and the in-depth reporting we deliver every day. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive great member benefits, including Cascade PBS Passport, with extended access to an on-demand library of local and PBS favorites. And being a member means you can sign up for the exclusive weekly Mossback Den newsletter from Knut Berger, where he offers greater insight into his latest historical discoveries. Go to cascadepbs.org/membership to sign up today. Mossback is a product of Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg. We'll be back soon with another episode.